This BBC podcast is supported by ads outside the UK.
I'm Krasi Ivanova-Twig from the Global Jigsaw podcast from the BBC, where we explore President Putin's idea of what it is to be Russian. It's packed up in one expression that's become the catchphrase of the moment, the Russian cultural code. We ask, what does it mean? The Global Jigsaw looks at the world through the lens of its media. Find us wherever you get your BBC podcasts.
Hello, it's Ray Winstone. I'm here to tell you about my podcast on BBC Radio 4, History's Toughest Heroes. I've got stories about the pioneers, the rebels, the outcasts who define tough.
And that was the first time that anybody ever ran a car up that fast with no tires on. It almost feels like your eyeballs are going to come out of your head.
Tough enough for you? Subscribe to History's Toughest Heroes wherever you get your podcast.
Hello. Today, Moscow, Abu Dhabi, Kiev and Geneva have all hosted peace negotiations this week. But despite the distances travelled, is an end to the war in Ukraine any closer? In the US, we witnessed the consequences of Donald Trump's decision to lift a moratorium on the death penalty. In Sweden, we hear how metalworkers are taking on the mighty force of Elon Musk's Tesla. And we're in the Loire Valley, where a riverside village shaped over centuries is now under threat from climate change. But first, Nigeria's President, Bola Tinubu, has declared a nationwide security emergency amidst a spate of kidnappings in the country's north. More than 250 children abducted from a Catholic school last Friday in Niger State are still missing, according to authorities. The incident was the third such abduction in Nigeria in a week, leading President Tinubu to cancel his trip to the G20 summit in South Africa. As yet, no individual group has claimed responsibility. Mayani Jones has been in Minna, the capital of Niger State.
The first story I covered as a new foreign correspondent was a mass kidnapping. Over 100 schoolgirls had been abducted from their boarding school in the northeastern Nigerian town of Dapchi in February of 2019. A month later, just as I landed in Lagos from London for the very first time, they were released. Within hours of landing in the country that would be my home for the next 6.5 years, I was filing for every outlet at the BBC on a story that would go on to dominate my career. During my time in Nigeria, I covered 5 more mass kidnappings of children. In 2021, I filmed a documentary about the uptick in abductions, interviewing parents, children and politicians across 3 northern Nigerian states. The last story I worked on was in March of 2024. An estimated 300 internally displaced women and children had been taken in the northeastern Borno state by the Islamist insurgent group Boko Haram. As we landed in Maiduguri, the state capital, news broke of another abduction of school children across the country in Kaduna. It felt like the cycle would never end. Shortly after that trip, I was diagnosed with PTSD. That last deployment had broken something in me. When I got home to see my own 2 happy toddlers playing far away from the dangers other children faced in the same country, I broke down in tears, took to my bed, and didn't leave for a week. I was signed off sick and went to therapy. The voices and tearful faces of the mothers I interviewed over the years came flooding back. The pictures of the children they might never see again haunted me. These mass kidnappings may seem like awful headlines to the majority of the world, but in northern Nigeria, they're tearing families apart, changing lives forever, and depriving millions of children of an education, as authorities close schools because of security concerns. The mass kidnap of 276 schoolgirls in Chibok back in 2014 was the first to catch global attention, but there had been others before then. Credible reports suggest Boko Haram didn't initially plan to take the girls. They first came to the technical boarding school to steal a brickmaking machine on site. When they saw the students sleeping in their dormitories, they decided to take them as well. That decision proved to be a lucrative one. Authorities are estimated to have paid at least 3 million euros to have them released. Armed gangs across northern Nigeria have resorted to kidnapping for ransom as a source of income. Boko Haram claimed to hate Western education, but they did not hate money. Other kidnapping gangs have claimed affiliation with the Islamic State group, but analysts believe their real motivation is often financial. Coming back to Nigeria after a year away in South Africa, where I now live, has highlighted how little has changed. One dad in the village of Papiri in Niger State, where 300 students were abducted from a Catholic school on the 21st of November, said his wife had lost her appetite from the stress. His 6-year-old son was prone to colds, and he was worried that the cool evenings in northern Nigeria would make him sick, as kidnappers often make their victims sleep out in the open. Another father 200 kilometers north in Kebbi State, whose daughters were released after a week, told me they reported walking long distances whilst in captivity, including across a river which came up to their necks. But many believe that the real rescue operations are happening in northern Nigeria's scraggy forests, between negotiators discreetly paying ransoms and armed groups who know the government and the children's families have no other option. The more high-profile the abduction, the higher the price. I worry that even reporting these stories just gives the kidnappers the publicity they desire. State governments have repeatedly denied paying for the release of abductees, but analysts say without payment, it's hard to see why the victims would be released. In 2021, one abductee from Niger State was detained for over 2 years, and over 100 Chibok girls are still missing 11 years later. Some of the survivors, now adult women, say they were forced to marry their abductors. These cases suggest the kidnappers are happy to keep their victims as long as they have to. In response to the most recent spate of abductions, Nigerian President Bola Tinubu has ordered the recruitment of an additional 50,000 police officers and said more personnel would be sent to vulnerable areas to avert further kidnappings. But this crisis seems intractable because it is. Putting an end to the violence would require solving northern Nigeria's economic inequality, corruption and poverty, providing jobs for the young men who find themselves without work and join kidnapping gangs either voluntarily or by force. Instead, in Maiduguri, shiny new hotels built by politicians spring up every other month. Across the country, half-finished flyovers that go nowhere cause chaos on the street, white elephants, hoovering up money that should go to public services. The solutions go beyond the usual deployment of troops to quell the violence for a while until the next wave of kidnappings. They require a long-term vision of how to deal with the conflict, something no one appears to have.
Mayani Jones. Next to Ukraine, Donald Trump expressed hope that Kiev would agree to a 28-point peace plan devised by Moscow and Washington in time for the Thanksgiving feast this week. He's since conceded this was too ambitious even for him. The plan, which emerged last week, sparked alarm among officials in Europe and Ukraine for giving away too many concessions to Russia. They duly thrashed out a revised plan in Geneva. But the question, as ever, is whether Vladimir Putin will agree. The BBC's Ukraine correspondent in Kiev, James Waterhouse, has been watching the latest efforts to end the war.
Kiev is a city of broken sleep. My return on Monday was followed by sirens and lethal fireworks from 1 a.m. It was a display of air defences struggling to contain swarms of Russian drones. By 7 a.m, I thought a fighter jet flew overhead, only for officials to say it was a cruise missile. There is no warming up for a war zone. You just arrive. I've spent most of the second half of this year away from Ukraine, travelling across Europe, covering the frenetic diplomatic efforts to end this war. Boots had been swapped for polished brogues. Suits had replaced flak jackets. In the absence of a clear battlefield outcome, it is, ultimately, the politics that will likely steer Russia's invasion to a halt. Since Donald Trump's return to office at the start of this year, there has been lots of process, but not much peace. It would be a mistake to suggest that the war has slowed in any way. 2025 has seen a pattern of Russia grinding out slow, bloody gains on the battlefield, but this year has also brought a new pattern of diplomacy. At first, the White House administration would side with Russia, even suggesting at one point that Ukraine was to blame for its own invasion. Then, European powers launched a Herculean charm offensive to get both it and Ukraine back into the conversation. There would be follow-up trips to the White House, state visits to the UK, all with declarations of support for the US president's peace vision, while reiterating support for Kyiv. Then, just as it looked like Ukraine was about to secure more weapons or tougher sanctions from Moscow, the White House would lean towards Russia again, or in the eyes of critics, at least allow it to buy time. Then the cycle would start over. From an editorial perspective, we try to spare you, the audience, from news stories that don't develop. Typically, you would file cyclical stories like these peace efforts under that, but the significance of the consequences makes it impossible to ignore. At the heart is the future existence of a country, a potential redrawing of borders through force, the resilience of NATO, and the future trajectory of Russian aggression. My return to Ukraine coincided with the leaking of a 28-point US peace plan. Even by the standards of the current news cycle, it sparked furious debate and intense diplomacy. A 6-hour air raid that week was an effective reminder of Ukraine's continued suffering and what was at stake. A war the Americans and Russians initially thought would last days is now never ending. And yet, as it approaches its 4th year, I find myself remembering the widespread belief that the First World War would be over by Christmas. In Kyiv, as people watched fragments of glass being swept up outside a charred apartment block this week, the mood there was not one of compromise for this war to end. Even if they occupy our land for years, we should make it hell for them, said one woman. Every detail of that leaked peace plan was revisited with crunch talks in Geneva between US and Ukrainian officials. Further leaks, this time phone calls, fueled suspicion, though unproven, that the first draft might have even been drafted by the Russians. There now seems to be a second version, although it's still not clear how either side is going to move from their red lines, not least around the fraught issue of recognizing occupied territory. It seems both Kyiv and Moscow are incentivized enough to engage with Donald Trump, but not enough to stop fighting. For a peace deal to last, it has to allow Ukraine to feel safe and Russia to feel, to an extent, victorious. At the moment, Vladimir Putin wants more and feels like he can get it. Currently, there is more political noise about a peace plan than there's ever been, but that's as far as it goes. What hasn't helped Ukraine is a corruption scandal that has now cost Zelensky's chief of staff and towering right-hand man, Andriy Yermak, his job. While back in the UK, I met the Ukrainian filmmaker Mstislav Chernov, who won an Oscar for covering Russia's early siege of Mariupol. He is visibly deeply affected by the ongoing war and has witnessed some of the sharpest fighting and deepest suffering. I asked him what Ukraine should give up for peace. Every metre of my country matters, he told me. Not just because of sacrifices in defending it, but also because people's homes and memories, including his own, are being destroyed. If Russia does get to keep hold of what it's taken, as is looking likely, it may never be returned.
James Waterhouse. When Donald Trump returned to the White House in January, he was quick to repeal a range of policies introduced by the previous administration. Among them, a moratorium on federal executions imposed by Joe Biden, who also granted more acts of clemency than any other president. So far this year, there have been more than 40 executions in 11 states. For one scheduled recently for a man named Tremaine Wood, our correspondent Hilary Anderson was selected as a witness. She sent this report from McAllister, Oklahoma.
It was pitch black, and the roads were empty. 4:30 in the morning. A nightmarish day lay ahead. At 10 a.m., a man was to be strapped to a gurney and executed whilst I sat feet away and watched. Immediate witness. My stomach was a knot. I was heading to the Oklahoma State Penitentiary. I looked up at the huge, clear, black skies spotted with stars and tried not to think of it. In the prison sat Tremaine Wood. On his 46th birthday last month, the prison authorities called him before them to tell him which drugs they'd used to kill him. The first injection, midazolam, is not a proper anesthetic. It's a sedative, which pharmacologists say leaves the prisoner conscious. The second shot paralyzes the prisoner, who then can't voluntarily move or scream when the third drug goes in, potassium chloride, which sends a fiery bolt to the heart. One Supreme Court justice who dissented on the court's decision that this drug protocol was not a cruel and unusual punishment said this method of execution might be the chemical equivalent of being burned at the stake. Tremaine was sentenced to death in 2004 for the murder of 19-year-old Ronnie Whith in a motel in Oklahoma City, a murder Tremaine's brother admitted to in Tremaine's trial. The brother, Jake, had good lawyers and got life without parole. Tremaine's lawyer abused alcohol and cocaine. he got death. The court was not required to prove Tremaine stabbed the victim. His active role in the armed robbery was enough to convict him of first-degree felony murder. The lawyer sent Tremaine a note afterwards saying, "Sorry, you got me at a bad time." Now, barring last-minute clemency granted either by the U.S. Supreme Court or Oklahoma's governor, today Tremaine would die. As the orange sun started to burn its great hole through the still night and dawn broke, the prison rose up before me, a white fortress, endless rolls of razor wire, blazing perimeter lights. I thought about Linda, Tremaine's mother, the night before, who clenched her jaws as she spoke of the excruciating waiting, tears dripping slowly, and her wait for the clock to tick 10 o'clock. I was ushered into a room for media witnesses, where I would wait before being taken to the execution chamber viewing room. There I'd been told a curtain would raise, Tremaine would be strapped down, he'd have 2 minutes for last words, an IV would be inserted, the drugs administered. He would die. We were not to speak. His body would be put in a body bag and taken out. It was 9:40, and I felt nauseous. The Supreme Court had just denied clemency. By now, Tremaine was in a room right outside the execution chamber, waiting. His mother, Linda, had shown me his recent words. "I am not a monster," he wrote. "I am not a killer." Linda was at home a 2-hour drive away, sitting on her bed in anguish. Tremaine's other brother, Andre, with her, in pieces, trying to stay strong. 9:45. Had Tremaine been strapped down, I wondered. The Department of Corrections press officer took an urgent call. Time for the bus to the chamber, I thought. One of the journalists behind me backed out of bearing witness. 9:50. 10 minutes to go. I remembered my granddad telling me many times how before he was 20, he had seen 9 electric chair executions as a crime reporter in Texas in the 1930s. I used to think, well, that was just the old days. I set my watch to time how long Tremaine struggled, if that was to happen, and how long to die. Bearing witness isn't just watching. Would this bring nightmares forever? If it was like this for me, I wondered, what was it like for the family? And how does a man sit in a room and face his own death? 9:57. 9:58. 9:59. No word. Why weren't we in the witness chamber already? Clemency, the press officer blurted out. Clemency. There would be no execution. The governor had granted clemency. When Tremaine was told, close to the minute of his death, he collapsed. To rise back up and collapse again that night, it is thought through stress. Executions across America have begun again with vigor under President Donald Trump, and many Oklahomans, who voted 2-1 in his favor in 2024, support the death penalty. I talked to one man the next day who said a 5-cent bullet would be better, and another man who wanted to see hangings brought back, or worse. On the road that morning, I had seen a shooting star, so bright, so close, that it felt like it would hit the car. For the family, for Tremaine, an unbelievable brightness came through the dark that day. As for the family of Ronnie Whip, the victim at the center of this story, they had repeatedly said they did not want the execution of Tremaine Wood to go ahead. Ronnie's mother, Barbara, whose voice revealed her terrible, never-ending, quiet distress after all these years of the loss of her son, said to me, "We believe it is God who judges on Judgment Day."
Hilary Anderson.
I'm Kras Ivanova-Twig from the Global Jigsaw podcast from the BBC, where we explore President Putin's idea of what it is to be Russian. It's packed up in one expression that's become the catchphrase of the moment, the Russian cultural code. We ask, what does it mean? The Global Jigsaw looks at the world through the lens of its media. Find us wherever you get your BBC podcasts.
Hello, it's Ray Winstone. I'm here to tell you about my podcast on BBC Radio 4, History's Toughest Heroes. I've got stories about the pioneers, the rebels, the outcasts who define tough.
And that was the first time that anybody ever ran a car up that fast with no tires on. It almost feels like your eyeballs are going to come out of your head.
Tough enough for you? Subscribe to History's Toughest Heroes wherever you get your podcast.
The longest strike in the modern history of Sweden recently passed its second anniversary. In one corner, 70 or so mechanics, all members of the Metalworkers Union. In the other, one of the richest companies in the world, Tesla. It's a simple argument whether or not to recognise the right of the union to negotiate on behalf of its members. Tim Mansell reports.
You'll know what IKEA is and the Nobel Prize. Perhaps you've read Pippi Longstocking or watched The Seventh Seal by Ingmar Bergman. But I'm guessing the Saltsjöbaden Agreement is a bit less familiar. All these things were part of a list of special items or achievements drawn up by a Swedish government commission earlier this year. A list that in some way is supposed to define Sweden or Swedishness. The Saltsjöbaden Agreement is an essential part of modern Swedish history, something that defined Swedish industrial culture in the second half of the 20th century and beyond. After decades of violent strikes, the country's employers and trade unions came together in 1938 to create a model where industrial relations would be covered by a series of negotiated collective agreements. Consensus would be the key to industrial harmony. But the American electric car manufacturer Tesla wants nothing to do with a collective agreement. And that's why I recently found myself spending the day in a mobile builder's van in Malmö, opposite a Tesla service centre. I was with Yanis Kuzma and Adel Sefsefi, who've both now been on strike for 2 years over the dispute. The union has been paying their salaries ever since. Yanis and Adel had stuck up a couple of banners and a few flags outside the van, but there wasn't much action. Across the road, work seemed to be going on pretty normally as locals drove their Teslas in and out, apparently undisrupted. We had sandwiches and coffee provided by the union, and at lunchtime a union rep arrived with pizza. Yanis is from Latvia. He's an intense man with a large beard. Adel from Tunisia has an easy laugh. He was especially exercised by Tesla's use of strike breakers. Nobody would dare do that in Tunisia, he said. But it's one reason why the standoff has gone on for so long. Not all of the 130 mechanics employed by Tesla in Sweden came out on strike, and Tesla has simply replaced those who did. Yanis has memories of working in post-Soviet Latvia, where he says the management style was rude and aggressive and paid little heed to workplace safety. Once he wasn't paid for 3 months running. His first job in Sweden was at a company that wasn't unionised, but he didn't mind because the conditions were still so good in comparison. But he soon learned that that depended upon who was in charge. And when he got to Tesla, he was surprised there was no collective agreement. Yanis says he's on strike because he owes it both to the workers of the future and to those who in the past have stood where he's now standing. He knows that strikes in Sweden used to be frequent and there was often violence. It reached a peak in May 1931 among the pulp mills that lined the Ångerman River up in the north. Strike breakers had been shipped in, as they often were, and the army was called in to protect them. The union organised a protest march to the village of Lunde, and the army opened fire. 5 people were killed. This is a little hard to imagine today. I drove up to Lunde to meet Håkon, a staunch union member who now does guided tours to commemorate the incident. His grandfather worked in the pulp mills in the 1920s, he said, his mother one of 8 siblings. Sometimes they were too poor to buy shoes, so the children couldn't go to school. Lunde stands on high ground that slopes down to the river. Håkon pointed out the route that the march took, the point where it was stopped on the road by a mounted soldier, and the place where the shots were fired. There's a monument to those who died, a dramatic rendition of a horse and a demonstrator with his union banner. Håkon still leaves flowers here, he tells me. Nearly 100 years later, Sweden's industrial culture is being challenged by an American company with apparently little respect for tradition. I asked Tesla for an interview, but they said they were too busy. Tesla's correct when it says it is not legally obliged to sign a collective agreement, but this is a country where 70% of workers are union members and 90% are covered by a collective agreement. It's a system welcomed by most employers as well. Apart from anything else, it's meant strikes here are rare. This one looks likely to run and run. It'll be another Korean War, said one man I met. The war that never officially ended.
Tim Mansell. And finally, we head to the Loire Valley in central France, where over centuries the steady flow of the Allier River has shaped the distinctive setting for a small village. While the ebb and flow of the river has long influenced life and geography in the region, the effects of climate change mean its future is now less certain. Sarah Wheeler reflects on its unusual evolution.
Along a valley cut by the main tributary of the Loire, cliff-like dwellings of granite and volcanic basalt look down benignly at the slow-flowing Allier. All the lower floors are windowless, blind to the late summer setting sun, but 10 or 20 metres up, painted shutters open like eyes. Many tens of thousands of years ago, around La Voûte-Chiac in France's southwestern Auvergne region, a rare geological formation shaped the course of the Allier into a boucle, an almost complete loop that today encloses the village like a chateau encloses its inner courtyard. At dusk, a few of the 255 people still living in La Voûte-Chiac walk in the middle of the buckle loop in the checkered shade of limes, looking out for the purple heron which came fishing by the priory yesterday. The bird was on the lookout for freshwater grayling, known in French as ombre des rivières, shadows of the rivers, which still thrive in the relatively unpolluted Allier from its source in the Massif Central all the way to Nevers, where it joins the Loire. The local priory was founded in the 11th century by Auvergne-born Odillon de Mercœur, abbot of the powerful Benedictine monastery at Cluny, and the village grew around it on the strip of land known in French as a presqu'île, an almost island. The priory's semicircular frontage mirrors the loop of the Allier. The unusual geography has shaped the history of the village. The boucle and its crystalline underwater rocks mean the level of the river fluctuates wildly and unpredictably. In 1586, super-high waters, called crues, swept the windmills away, destroying the villagers' wheat-based livelihood. A survivor recorded the baleful event in a chronicle written in the Auvergnat dialect. This northern branch of the still just about alive but endangered Occitan language is embedded in local names. The word Volta, which in Auvergnat means boucle or loop, made its way into the name of La Voûte-Chiac. At the end of the 15th century, two girls playing along the banks of the Allier by the La Voûte-Chiac priory found a pebble displaying what looked like a woman carrying a child. The bishop immediately recognised the Virgin herself. Soon, pilgrims from across France came to pray to the pebble relic, still proudly displayed in the priory today. Marian protection notwithstanding, in 1733 fresh rising waters destroyed the four-arched medieval bridge, still then the only Allier crossing on the Lyon to Toulouse trade route, and while the villagers were rebuilding it, more crues destroyed their wooden scaffolding. In 1866, floods killed 30. Watermills powered the threshing into the 20th century, but the waters did for them in the end too. The industrious Auvergnats have always set up their own climate mitigation schemes. During floods, all those windowless lower rooms in La Voûte-Chiac's riverside homes fill with water, thus safeguarding the building's structural integrity against the force of the currents. The village has thrived for centuries despite the crues, but the nationwide French exodus to the cities in the 1960s thinned the population more permanently than floods ever had. Even the boulangerie is only open 2 days a week now. Here in the landlocked département of Haute-Loire, the climate crisis is colliding with known hazards to complicate and greatly exacerbate existing problems. Carbon-burning human activity is affecting geography, as opposed to the other way round. Projections indicate an increase in the number of intense rainfall events, posing a more severe flood risk to La Voûte-Chiac. Rapidly rising summer temperatures and more frequent heat waves also threaten the overall equilibrium of the Allier watershed. Villagers hope the Pebble Virgin has one more miracle left in her. La Voûte-Chiac is unusual, but so is everywhere in its own unique way. A different set of climate-related issues will at some stage pop up not just around lovely loops in a river, but in every village, every city, every country. We are all prisoners of geography now.
Sarah Wheeler, and that's all for today. We'll be back again next Saturday morning. Do join us.
I'm Shari Val, and I've been investigating fraud for decades. Now I'm shining light on the secret techniques criminals use to steal your money. With insight from guest experts and the real people involved in these scams, so you can see the fraudsters coming before it's too late. That's the new series of Scam Secrets. Listen now on BBC Sounds.
I'm Krasi Ivanova-Twig from the Global Jigsaw podcast from the BBC, where we explore President Putin's idea of what it is to be Russian. It's packed up in one expression that's become the catchphrase of the moment, the Russian cultural code. We ask, what does it mean? The Global Jigsaw looks at the world through the lens of its media. Find us wherever you get your BBC podcasts.
Hello, it's Ray Winstone. I'm here to tell you about my podcast on BBC Radio 4, History's Toughest Heroes. I've got stories about the pioneers, the rebels, the outcasts who define tough.
And that was the first time that anybody ever ran a car up that fast with no tires on. It almost feels like your eyeballs are going to come out of your head.
Tough enough for you? Subscribe to History's Toughest Heroes wherever you get your podcast.
This BBC podcast is supported by ads outside the UK.
I'm Krasi Ivanova-Twig from the Global Jigsaw podcast from the BBC, where we explore President Putin's idea of what it is to be Russian. It's packed up in one expression that's become the catchphrase of the moment, the Russian cultural code. We ask, what does it mean? The Global Jigsaw looks at the world through the lens of its media. Find us wherever you get your BBC podcasts.
Hello, it's Ray Winstone. I'm here to tell you about my podcast on BBC Radio 4, History's Toughest Heroes. I've got stories about the pioneers, the rebels, the outcasts who define tough.
And that was the first time that anybody ever ran a car up that fast with no tires on. It almost feels like your eyeballs are going to come out of your head.
Tough enough for you? Subscribe to History's Toughest Heroes wherever you get your podcast.
BBC Sounds. Music, radio, podcasts.
Hello. Today we're in Zimbabwe, 25 years on from the Mugabe-era land seizures, where black and white communities hope a new scheme can bring reconciliation. We're in Taiwan's Kinmen Islands, where traditional ways of life are under threat and the fear of war with China lingers. In Lithuania, we visit a notorious former prison whose dark past proved the perfect setting for the sci-fi series Stranger Things. And finally, we're in Peru, where we go off-grid in the high Andes, riding on mules past lakes and waterfalls and rapidly disappearing glaciers. But first to the war in Gaza, where the death toll continues to rise, with more than 57,000 people now killed in the conflict, according to the Hamas-run health ministry. While many Israelis want an end to the war, the focus of demands has largely been centred around the return of hostages taken captive by Hamas during its attack in 2023, in which around 1,200 Israelis were killed. But there's also a small but visible peace movement emerging, which is calling for an end to the conflict for the sake of the Palestinian people. Our correspondent Wira Davis met activists in Jerusalem.
Sapir Sluska Amran knows that she's part of a tiny minority, but the lawyer and occasional writer is undeterred, convinced that what she's doing is right, despite the flack that comes her way. Many people think that I'm a traitor, she tells me. It's not just that they don't agree with me, they see what I'm doing as an act of resistance. As we speak, Sapir is handing out posters to around 30 like-minded people as they head out to protest. But theirs is a protest with a difference. Demonstrations calling for an end to the Gaza war are nothing new in Israel. Indeed, the high-profile, vocal and well-supported Hostages and Missing Families Forum is a regular feature outside government offices and in public spaces. The names and faces of the hostages are omnipresent, in shop windows, on car bumper stickers and on posters outside the Prime Minister's office. But the names and faces on posters being held by Sapir and her friends aren't of Israeli hostages, they're of Palestinian children killed in the Gaza war. Their demonstration is on a road outside an Israeli Air Force base in central Israel, from where some of the regular sorties to bomb Gaza take off. Not wanting to risk arrest by the police patrols who quickly swing by, Sapir says the protest is deliberately silent. They don't chant, shout or try to block traffic entering the base. But the words on the posters do carry messages in Hebrew and English, calling for Air Force pilots to refuse to bomb and that your bombs are killing innocent people, including the hostages. We're not coming here to blame the pilots, we're coming here to ask them to act and to do the right thing, says activist Yali Marom. We're giving them an opportunity to choose different. In a country still traumatised by the events of October the 7th, it's important to emphasise that these are not opinions held by most Israelis. Apart from a few notable exceptions in newspapers and online publications, the number of people killed in Gaza or the humanitarian crisis in the Palestinian territory barely makes the news. It's not that such opinions and images are censored, it's that television stations choose not to air them. And I'm told, apart from the plight of the hostages, political or family debate rarely strays into the realm of what's happening in Gaza. That wasn't until last March when Benjamin Netanyahu turned his back on a brief but popular ceasefire process in which dozens of hostages were released from Hamas captivity in exchange for hundreds of Palestinian prisoners from Israeli jails. Tired of conflict, Israelis and Palestinians contemplated the end of the region's most destructive war. Recent polling suggested that a significant majority, 59% of Israelis, want the fighting in Gaza to end in exchange for the remaining hostages. The poll in the Maariv newspaper also suggested that almost half of those people asked, some 49%, thought the only reason Mr. Netanyahu was continuing the war was for his own political considerations after becoming embroiled in damaging legal battles. But people should write off the 75-year-old longest-serving Prime Minister in Israeli history at their peril, says Professor Tamar Herman from the Israel Democracy Institute. The guy is a very skillful political actor, she says, adding there is no more skilled politician in Israel. He took a huge gamble attacking Iran's nuclear program after years of having threatened to do so. After a war that only lasted 12 days, Bibi Netanyahu basked in the glory of a spectacular military victory over his nemesis. He was said to be contemplating snap elections and yet another term as Prime Minister. But he hasn't enjoyed as big a bounce from the war with Iran as he might have hoped for. Trust, says Professor Herman, is a big problem for Benjamin Netanyahu. On the international stage, many Israelis accuse Mr. Netanyahu of having harmed Israel's global standing and its economic prospects by needlessly prolonging the war in Gaza, even though many former generals have said the Israel Defense Forces have achieved as much as is militarily possible in the Palestinian territory. Israel is deeply divided, its politics polarized. What happens next is something few people in this region know the answer to. The voices of collaboration and coexistence between Israelis and Palestinians that you used to hear in these parts have almost completely vanished. For peace activists Sapir and Yali, quietly trying to draw attention to what is happening in Gaza, the future is ominous. Let's talk about existence first, then we can talk about coexistence, says Yali. There is no future where only Jews are living here or only Palestinians living here. It's been devastating and it's going to take time, he says. It may take decades, but I still believe we can find ways to live together in an equal system.
We're Davis. Next to Zimbabwe. It's 25 years since Robert Mugabe's controversial land reform program fueled a wave of violent land seizures from the country's white farmers, transferring ownership to black Zimbabweans. While popular among many Mugabe supporters who saw it as addressing the wrongs of British colonial rule, it proved devastating for the country's economy. Today, the current government has begun paying compensation to white farmers forced from their land. Shingai Nyoka considers whether it can help bring much-desired reconciliation.
Land ownership in Zimbabwe has proved one of the nation's most divisive issues. When I was growing up, it often left me conflicted. On the one hand, many white farmers being thrown off fertile land were my former classmates' parents. On the other, my own parents had grown up in arid rural villages where their forebears had been dumped in often violent colonial-era land seizures. Then, as a journalist in the 2000s, I'd covered stories of white farmers severely beaten and killed by those taking over the land. Back then, many of them were tough, unwavering, and prepared to fight back. So it's hard to reconcile that memory of white farmers with those I met recently. In a conference room in a Harare suburb, I was struck by how these men, once the backbone of Zimbabwe's economy, had aged considerably, with some visibly unwell. 25 years on, their hardline positions have softened, and they've accepted a compromise deal. President Mnangagwa's government recently issuing the first payouts to white farmers following a compensation offer of some $3.5 billion. The compensation, which will largely be paid through government bonds, not cash, covers farm infrastructure like barns and dams, but not the value of the land itself, which the government says was illegally seized from black Zimbabweans by the colonial government. Among those receiving compensation is 71-year-old Arthur Baisley, a slight, reserved man. He walks with a cane following back surgery last year and told me he needs to pay off his medical bills and take care of his sick parents. He offered up his farm to black farmers in 2001 and has only now been paid. Arthur says that although it was difficult to give up his farm, it's now time to let go of the past and move on. He also says he can't afford to wait for another deal, though more than 3/4 of the former farmers have rejected the offer. I met their leader, Dion Taron, rummaging through boxes of his possessions, hastily packed during his own eviction back in 2008. Today they fill the veranda of his city home in Harare. His eyes are filled with tears as he talks about how he resisted eviction from his dairy farm, which he bought not long after Zimbabwe became independent back in 1980. He told me he'd been prepared to go to jail over it until his friends convinced him otherwise. He says Britain, the former colonial power, has a role to play too. There's a match taking place here, and the British can't go sit in the pavilion, he told me. Much of the narrative about agriculture in Zimbabwe has focused on the white farmers, but what of the 250,000 black Zimbabweans that replaced them? Many didn't have skills at the time they were allocated land, and agricultural production collapsed. But that's changing. I headed south of the capital to meet two brothers in their 20s who turned their families' fortunes around. In 2001, their father arrived on a newly awarded plot on a bicycle. One of 77 farmers apportioned a section of what was a large tobacco farm. 25-year-old Aaron Gagne, heavy set with a swagger about him, said they reinvested the little profits they made and built up a bare piece of land into a large enterprise with 200 workers, high-tech tobacco barns, and livestock too. Aaron is pragmatic. He told me it was fair white farmers were being compensated and suggested black farmers should pay a tax based on what they inherited to help fund the deal. I put this to a group of war veterans from Zimbabwe's independence war who I met on a former ostrich farm in northern Harare. They still see themselves as guardians of the land, and they disagree with the government's scheme. No one compensated our forefathers for colonial-era land seizures, said Godfrey Gurira, a stocky, grey-haired and well-spoken man. It's an unnecessary act of appeasement, he went on, explaining that he and his group had filed a lawsuit against the government, challenging the legality of the deal, saying it was made without parliamentary consent. 25 years on since the land seizures, disagreements over land in Zimbabwe continue, but it feels like the country has made a step forward, albeit small. I would never have imagined so many white farmers would now concede that land reform was necessary. The problem now is trying to reach a consensus about what justice looks like for everyone. After all, Zimbabwe's social cohesion, its economy, its entire future depends on it.
Shingai Nyoka. Next, we're in Kinmen, a cluster of islands governed by Taiwan, just a few miles off the coast of mainland China. In the past, Chinese leaders have tried to annex this Taiwanese outpost, though Mao Zedong's efforts were successfully repelled back in 1949. That was followed a decade later by a massive artillery bombardment which prompted US intervention. Today, locals continue to live amid ongoing tensions with China and, finds Adrian Bridge, the struggle between modern and traditional ways of life.
From the northern shore of the largest of the Taiwanese Kinmen Islands, not only can you see China, you can hear it. Boom, boom, boom. I'm spending a morning with master oyster catcher Ching Go, as he sets to collecting the pick of the day's oysters, clams and snails that have attached themselves to the granite poles in his patch of this very special stretch of the Taiwan Strait. The sun is shining, the sea is shimmering, and the wet sand is soft on the feet. All very idyllic. Look up, though, and you get a very different perspective. The huge sweep of high-rise towers that line the coast around the ever-expanding Chinese port city of Xiamen. With this metropolis barely more than a mile across the strait, far nearer than the main island of Taiwan, the air is filled with the sound of the bangs and booms accompanying the construction of a vast new airport on what will be reclaimed land. The airport, due to open next year, will serve the Chinese province of Fujian, and it's a reminder of China's clout in the region. Ching Go was a boy of 7 when the shelling commenced back in 1958. I looked up in the sky, and it was like a sea of shooting stars, he tells me. I was in the mountains with my grandfather. We hid in a ditch with baskets over our heads. My mother was so worried. She wept when we finally returned. Despite a fierce bombardment lasting several weeks, the Kinmen Islanders refused to be cowed into submission and began firing back. A stalemate ensued, and for the next 20 years, both sides repeatedly shelled each other across the narrow gap that separates them. Slightly bizarrely, they agreed that one side would fire on odd days and the other on even days. The islands are replete with reminders of that conflict. There are statues commemorating military heroes, and ageing tanks and warships are prominent at every turn. Tourist attractions here include underground bunkers that once hid naval vessels, and a lookout post for spying and broadcasting messages to the other side. The coastline is littered with barricades designed to stop an amphibious invasion from the mainland. The thawing of relations between China and the US in the late 1970s resulted in an end to the mutual shelling and a cessation of open hostilities. But given their proximity to the mainland, the Kinmen Islands would be extremely vulnerable should Beijing one day seek to realise its long-stated goal to reunify China and Taiwan. I asked Ching Go, a wise and wizened old man with endearing gaps in his teeth and a slender frame, whether he fears what lies ahead. I've seen it all before, he tells me. I do not worry. If the Chinese do attack, it will be the main island, not here. But I do not think it will come to conflict. Yet Ching Go is critical of Taiwanese politicians, the current president, La Ching-de, foremost among them, who reject China's sovereignty claims, saying only Taiwan's people can decide their future. We have to be careful. We must not poke the bear, he says. And with that, he returns to the pressing task at hand, the extraction of great bagfuls of oysters from their extraordinary breeding ground in the shallow but deeply controversial waters of the Taiwan Strait. With younger generations unwilling to put in the back-breaking work required, Ching Go, now 74, is one of the last members of the Kinmen oyster farming community. Over lunch, in the quiet courtyard of his modest abode, he shucks oysters like there is no tomorrow, and hands them to me, along with generously filled glasses of Gaolian liquor, a highly potent spirit. The oysters, accompanied with a dash of lemon, are delicious, and the liquor certainly hits the spot. I smile at the old man, and he smiles back. It's an utterly surreal experience, the calm, perhaps, before the storm. I think back to our time together and the gathering of the much-prized molluscs under the midday sun. Idyllic indeed, But in my mind's eye, I see the high-rise towers of Xiamen and hear the pounding beat of the drills and drums that every minute, centimetre by centimetre, are bringing the Chinese mainland ever closer to Taiwan.
Adrian Bridge.
I'm Krasiva Twig from the Global Jigsaw podcast from the BBC, where we explore President Putin's idea of what it is to be Russian. It's packed up in one expression that's become the catchphrase of the moment, the Russian cultural code. We ask, what does it mean? The Global Jigsaw looks at the world through the lens of its media. Find us wherever you get your BBC podcasts.
Hello, it's Ray Winstone. I'm here to tell you about my podcast on BBC Radio 4, History's Toughest Heroes. I've got stories about the pioneers, the rebels, the outcasts who define tough.
And that was the first time that anybody ever ran a car up that fast with no tires on. It almost feels like your eyeballs are going to come out of your head.
Tough enough for you? Subscribe to History's Toughest Heroes wherever you get your podcast.
Next, we're in Lithuania, where the question of what to do with Soviet-era institutions has proven to be a polarizing one. One such example sits right in the middle of the capital, Vilnius, the imposing Lukashka's prison. Once infamous for its appalling conditions, it swallowed up political prisoners, activists and exiles for decades. But since the last prisoners left in 2019, it's undergone a transformation into a hip new artistic hub. But is this newfound culture of cool cashing in on a once dark past? Joshua Askew recently paid a visit.
The first thing that hits you when you step inside Lukashka's prison is the smell. The air is dank, its walls are grimy, peeling, dingy lights flicker. Fortunately, I am not a prisoner, but instead here on a tour. Our guide Emma, a young woman with electric blue hair, fizzes with energy. Her tour is interactive and informal. She even cracks jokes. But her humour has a rationale. The history of Lukashka's, like Lithuania's, is difficult to digest. Comedy can make it a little easier to confront. Moscow ruled Lithuania between 1940 and 1991. Though the small Baltic state is now free and firmly in NATO, there's still a nervousness about the giant military power nearby. In one cell, a cardboard cutout of Vladimir Putin startles me. Emma quips it represents a bright future where Russia's leader faces justice for his devastating invasion of Ukraine, something that has stirred up painful memories inside Lithuania. Enter local historian Vladas Liepaonius, the man who designed the tour. He tells me the prison complex was built in 1905 when Lithuania was part of the Tsarist Russian Empire, the USSR's predecessor. It was then one of the priciest buildings ever constructed in the region, inspired by Bentham's Panopticon, a conceptual building where prisoners feel monitored, even if they aren't. The facility was ultra-modern, combining new technology like central heating with cutting-edge approaches to discipline and punishment. Over the decades, as Vilnius passed from Tsarist to Polish, then Nazi to Soviet hands, Lukashka's endured as a terror machine for each regime's foes. Vladas calls it an emblem of the Bloodlands, the name for the chunk of Eastern and Central Europe ravaged by communism and fascism. During the 1940s, Nazis and their local collaborators orchestrated mass executions of Jews from Lukashka's. Stalin later sent thousands of its detainees to gulags, never to be seen again. Though not everything at Lukashka's was sinister, it was a rare prison in Lithuania with Russian Orthodox, Catholic and Jewish places of worship. Here, a plethora of religions and nationalities shared their everyday lives in ways unimaginable on the outside. After Lithuania declared its independence from the USSR in 1990, the ever-dilapidated facility remained in use. I asked Vladas to paint a picture of prison life. It's not pretty. Up to 8 prisoners crammed into cells designed for 2. Their toilet, a communal bucket. Cells often flooded as Lukashka's outdated plumbing buckled under the pressure. Central heating routinely broke down. All this in a country where temperatures can drop to as low as -20. Things started changing in 2004 when Lithuania joined the EU. bringing with it new legal standards. Prisoners lodged complaints with the European Court of Human Rights. Only a stone's throw from the country's parliament, Lukashka's was not a good look. It finally closed in 2019. Today, Lukashka's is almost unrecognisable. Its once forbidding walls now house art studios, concerts, and even a bar. Young hipsters drink and dance, seemingly oblivious to its painful past. Their clinking glasses and laughter contrast strangely with the rusted iron bars and razor wire, now forming a trendy aesthetic. Tour guide Emma says she'd hate to see Lukashka's demolished to make way for yet another shopping mall, a fate suffered by some of Vilnius's other historic buildings. Lukashka's also educates people about history, but is it being preserved in a meaningful way or simply commodified? Some Jewish and Roma groups say its new incarnation insults the Holocaust's victims. This feeling only grew when the hit Netflix series Stranger Things was filmed there. Vilnius's tourism board advertised sales styled on the series on Airbnb, but rode back after criticism. In a way, I feel the prison reflects the renewal of a now prospering Lithuania. But, as always in the Bloodlands, the spectre of history casts a long shadow. The identities of those who carried out the executions at the facility during the Soviet era, some of whom are still alive, remains unknown. Calls have been made for the government to publicise their names to bring justice to the victims. Nothing so far. I leave Lukashka's thinking about what Emma told me. We cannot hide what happened to us, she said. Not talking about the traumas of occupation and repression fueled depression, alcoholism, and suicide in older generations. But history is like a splinter. We have to get it out.
Joshua Askew. And finally, regular listeners to the programme might be more familiar with our Budapest correspondent Nick Thorpe's tales of travelling across Central Europe, be it gliding down the Danube, tracking bears in the Carpathian Mountains, or taking the train with the Serbian president. In a recent change of scene, he ventured to South America and the high Andes of Peru on a visit to see his son, and sent this report from the Cordillera Blanca range.
The strange thing about riding on the back of a big animal is that all the other animals look at you like you are that big animal, not some measly human. The stray dogs at the edge of the village who would snarl at you if you arrived on 2 feet cower away. The bull behind that big stone wall gazes at you a little apprehensively like an equal. Riding on muleback through villages and up along the higher mountain tracks of the Peruvian Andes, we felt like royalty. Even if Machi Pachi, the mule my son nobly surrendered to his aging father, was determined to stop and chew at every juicy clump of grass we passed. Even if it rained every day, though not all day, as we climbed up through the Cajahuascancha Valley to 4,500 metres above sea level. And we collected firewood in the rain and washed the dishes in freezing rivers, then huddled round the fire to cook simple meals as the smoke curled up through the long grass roof of the shepherd's round stone hut. We slept in our tents like well-fed dogs. And on those days when the sun occasionally did flash a smile, even the peak of San Juan, usually invisible in a conclave of clouds, put in a brief, shy appearance. The eastern valleys of the Cordillera Blanca mountains of central Peru are awash with mud in the rainy season, the Lonely Planet guide warned us, out of bounds to even the hardiest backpackers. But here we were, my son Mate and his girlfriend Eleonora, my wife Andrea and I, riding and walking through the rain, ducking to dodge the low-hanging branches of their caunia trees through altitudes which hurt your brain and steal your breath away until you get used to them. After a rest day, surrounded by inquisitive, semi-wild donkeys, we rode up to Milpa Lake, where Mate caught rainbow trout for supper, and we sat at the foot of a massive waterfall in a grove of caunia trees sheltering from the rain. How we enjoyed the silence of the phone, completely off-grid. No longer a dictatorial communication toy stealing our attention by day and night, it had been reduced to a slim and excellent camera. Meanwhile, the mountains, the waterfalls, the last glaciers towered over us like planetary aunts and uncles, and woe betide anyone who doesn't show them the necessary respect. After a few days in the last hut or choza at the top of the valley, we meet Andres and Paulina, a shepherd couple, both in their 90s, who spend 3 weeks of every 4 up there looking after 150 sheep. They covered the mountainsides at speeds that put my sluggish English legs and lungs to shame. When Andres gestures, he points with his long stick as though it had a telescopic lens. They regret the new road planned up through the valley, they say. They miss the ice on the melting glaciers and offer advice on where to catch the best fish. On our last day in the valley, we reached the furthest lagoon, right at the foot of what's left of the glacier. This is where Miguel, another shepherd, used to come to cut blocks of ice to sell in the village when he was 18. Now he's nearly 50, and the ice is long out of reach, he says, leaving a line of slippery, hard-scrabble rock. By 2056, according to a recent report, there could be no glaciers at all left in the Peruvian Andes, on which some 20 million people depend for their drinking water, as many as 90 million people across South America as a whole. The lake water hovers just above freezing point. We strip naked and swim from one rock to the next, screaming like banshees. I don't think I've ever felt so awake or alive. The mules wait for us patiently in the pasture like broad-shouldered birds, ready to carry us back down into a world which values them less and less, because it rarely looks up from its flat screens anymore into the still, wild depths of their eyes.
Nick Thorpe. And that's all for today, but you can hear more stories on the From Our Own Correspondent podcast on BBC Sounds, including a dispatch on why Paraguay is staking a claim to Lionel Messi's favourite drink. We'll be back again next Saturday morning. Do join us.
I'm David Runciman, and from BBC Radio 4, this is Post-War.
From the cradle to the grave, they said.
80 years on, we're telling the story of the 1945 election and the creation of post-war Britain.
There must be a revolution in our way of living.
This is the Britain that many of us grew up in, and which still shapes an idea of who we think we are.
Even Winston Churchill thrown out. All right, you may have won the war, but are you going to win the peace?
Post-war with me, David Runciman. Listen on BBC Sounds.
Can we have the Britain we desire?
I'm Krasi Ivanova-Twig from the Global Jigsaw podcast from the BBC, where we explore President Putin's idea of what it is to be Russian. It's packed up in one expression that's become the catchphrase of the moment, the Russian cultural code. We ask, what does it mean? The Global Jigsaw looks at the world through the lens of its media. Find us wherever you get your BBC podcasts.
Hello, it's Ray Winstone. I'm here to tell you about my podcast on BBC Radio 4, History's Toughest Heroes. I've got stories about the pioneers, the rebels, the outcasts who define tough.
And that was the first time that anybody ever ran a car up that fast with no tires on. It almost feels like your eyeballs are going to come out of your head.
Tough enough for you? Subscribe to History's Toughest Heroes wherever you get your podcast.
This BBC podcast is supported by ads outside the UK.
I'm Krasi Ivanova-Twig from the Global Jigsaw podcast from the BBC, where we explore President Putin's idea of what it is to be Russian. It's packed up in one expression that's become the catchphrase of the moment, the Russian cultural code. We ask, what does it mean? The Global Jigsaw looks at the world through the lens of its media. Find us wherever you get your BBC podcasts.
Hello, it's Ray Winstone. I'm here to tell you about my podcast on BBC Radio 4, History's Toughest Heroes. I've got stories about the pioneers, the rebels, the outcasts who define tough.
And that was the first time that anybody ever ran a car up that fast with no tires on. It almost feels like your eyeballs are going to come out of your head.
Tough enough for you? Subscribe to History's Toughest Heroes wherever you get your podcast.
BBC Sounds. Music, radio, podcasts.
Hello. Today, amid Donald Trump's tariff war, we hear from Chinese traders who claim they can do just fine without America's custom. We're in Romania as it prepares for a second attempt at a general election after last year's vote was called off following claims of Russian interference. In Bolivia, we meet the miners working in a centuries-old mine, shrouded in myth and legend, situated in one of the world's highest cities. And finally to Rome, where cardinals can be seen in hushed conversation at the city's trattorias before the papal conclave begins next week. But first, Israel's war in Gaza, more than a year and a half long, grinds on. Since Israel broke the ceasefire in the middle of March, more than 2,000 Palestinians have been killed, according to the Hamas-run Gaza Health Ministry. Meanwhile, 59 Israeli hostages remain in Gaza. But the resumption of war has also spurred protests among both Israelis and Palestinians desperate for the conflict to end. These have taken different forms and involve taking very different risks, as our correspondent Paul Adams reports.
In the week that saw Israel remember its fallen soldiers and then, the following day, celebrate its independence, the war in Gaza cast a long shadow. It's been almost 19 months, almost the longest war in Israel's turbulent 77-year history. A war it didn't seek, but seems unwilling or unable to stop. And for Palestinians, bombed, harried, driven this way and that, scrambling every day just to survive, a disaster beyond imagination. A war they also did not seek, but which will not let them go. On both sides, people are saying to those driving this conflict, please, stop. For the past month, anger has boiled over in Israel and Gaza, a simultaneous but entirely separate set of protests by people taking different risks but looking to achieve the same goal: relief. In Israel, where anti-war protests have clogged the streets of Tel Aviv practically every week for well over a year, it's been a month of open letters, from veterans and reservists representing practically every branch of the military, starting with the Air Force but moving on to the infantry, special forces, navy, even the Army's elite intelligence unit. Thousands of men and women, some with decades of experience, calling on the Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu to do whatever it takes to bring home the remaining 59 Israeli hostages, even if that means stopping the war. Mr. Netanyahu has reacted furiously, accusing the signatories of encouraging Israel's enemies and dismissing them as a bunch of anarchists and pensioners. But the soft-spoken, idealistic reservist I met in a leafy Jerusalem park a couple of weeks back was anything but. He said he'd had no hesitation reporting for duty in the wake of the Hamas attacks of October the 7th. I believed I was doing something good, he told me, describing his deployment to Gaza last summer. Complicated, but good. But the longer the war went on, the more his misgivings grew about the methods used and the goals being sought. I'm a patriot, he insisted, a Zionist, but I believe in peace. The war is cynical, political, he said, more about Benjamin Netanyahu's desire to cling to power than an effort to bring the hostages home. We spoke on condition that we didn't identify him. He felt he was taking a risk, that foreigners might assume he was guilty of war crimes, while Israelis, seeing him talking to the BBC, would accuse him of airing Israel's dirty laundry in public. But Israel, whatever else you might think, is still a democracy. Most Israelis are free to speak out, most of the time, about most issues. They have the right. They exercise it noisily and with passion. In Gaza, it's very different, which makes the past few weeks all the more remarkable. Hamas may have been elected to power, but that was almost 20 years ago. Since then, the group has ruled with an iron rod, crushing dissent, beating, jailing, and sometimes killing its opponents. But since March, Gazans have taken to the streets, in groups large and small, voicing fury at an organisation many increasingly see as responsible for bringing about this calamity. demanding that Hamas hand over the remaining hostages, or better still, just leave. Out, 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 they chant. Such voices have been heard before, but rarely in such numbers, rarely so openly. The risks are enormous. Towards the end of March, one protester, 22-year-old Odey Al-Rubai, published a haunting video on social media. He said Hamas were coming after him. They've destroyed us and brought ruin, he said. Gaza has become a city of ghosts. A few days later, Odey was dead, his broken body delivered back to his family. The Palestinian Independent Commission for Human Rights said Odey had been tortured and called his death a grave violation of the right to life and an extrajudicial killing, the price of speaking out. But Moumen al-Natour, a Gaza lawyer and long-time critic of Hamas, seems undaunted. He spoke to us on camera from his home in Gaza. We need to speak out, he said, to take a risk. Hamas came to power when Moumen was just 11. The years since have been dominated by war and violence. My life, he said, has been wasted. Humanity demands that we raise our voices. Wasted lives and the urgent need to speak out. It's what's driving people, Palestinians and Israelis, to confront their respective risks and demand that this ruinous war finally end.
Paul Adams. Next, as Donald Trump marked 100 days in office this week, Beijing published a slick video in which it called on the world to stand up to American bullying. China's manufacturing sector saw a sharp contraction this month as trade between the world's two leading economies continues to stutter. Major retailers in the US have warned the White House that American customers could face empty shelves in the coming weeks if the 145% tariffs remain in place. Our China correspondent Laura Bicker has been to the world's largest wholesale market to find out how Chinese traders are holding up.
Twinkling fairy lights and flashing Santas illuminate a labyrinth of halls in just one corner of the world's biggest wholesale market. If you've ever bought a fake tree or a laughing gnome, it likely came from here. Yiwu is a city in the eastern province of Zhejiang, a manufacturing and export hub, which is home to more than 30 ports and accounted for around 17% of all Chinese sales to the US last year. The market is a vast showroom where buyers come from all over the world, looking for just about anything, from snow globes to massage guns. We wandered into one corner that felt like an endless Christmas grotto, strung with every colour of tinsel and sparkling snowflakes. Alongside were aisles filled with decorations for another popular American celebration, Halloween. A Donald Trump mask sat between that of a zombie and Frankenstein. "It's quite popular," said the saleswoman. Another rep spotted us and offered us a seat while she whipped out her order book. Look, she said. "I have so few orders from the US now. Most of my stock now goes to South America." I could see she was trying to figure out how honest to be with us, as we were being followed by local officials monitoring our conversations, a regular occurrence when reporting in China. But she decided just to speak her mind. "Donald Trump is pretty crazy. Why is he doing this?" she asked. "We'll lose money, yes, maybe 10, maybe 20% of our business. But we will adapt. We've been here before." Other traders told us the same thing. They would take a hit, but they could survive without the US. Things changed here during Mr. Trump's first trade war with China, which kicked off in 2018. It taught the traders of Yiwu a lesson, that they needed to find new markets. Many of them told me they are learning Spanish and Arabic to complement their English. In the last few weeks, my team and I have travelled to several trade fairs and talked to various businesses on the phone to try to assess the impact of this new chapter. The message is always one of defiance. Bowing to a bully is like drinking poison to quench thirst. It only deepens the crisis, Beijing declared in a government video published on Donald Trump's 100th day in office. "History has proven compromise won't earn you mercy. Kneeling only invites more bullying. China won't kneel down," it added. But behind this bold rhetoric, Chinese businesses are dealing with the harsh reality of high tariffs, which are beginning to cause some pain in a country already grappling with several economic challenges. Some traders have told the BBC that exports meant for American households are piling up in warehouses. One supplier told us he had 500,000 pieces of clothing waiting to ship to America's biggest retailer, Walmart. Still, Beijing is betting that American consumers will feel the absence of Chinese goods or face paying higher prices. The US still relies heavily on Chinese manufacturing to meet its own domestic demand. Retail giants Walmart and Target reportedly told Mr. Trump in a meeting last week that shoppers are likely to see empty shelves and higher prices from next month. In turn, the Trump administration appears to have misjudged the scale of China's economic problems and hoped President Xi would be desperate to make a quick deal. Economic growth here has slowed. In fact, growth is slower now than any time in the last 3 decades. But it is far from falling into recession. Indeed, this crisis provides President Xi with a ready-made excuse for an ailing economy. From now on, he can blame the US for any economic pain. Back in the halls of Iwu's wholesale market, our team wander into the toy department, where we have to raise our voices above a cacophony of singing dolls, squeaking toy dogs, and buzzing robots. The local officials have found another journalist to monitor, and finally we get to speak to traders without being watched. America must need China, insists one, while gesturing to an array of fluffy stuffed toys and dolls. Later, another trader admits that the US and China might indeed need one another. But he wouldn't say how much.
Laura Bicker. Now to Romania, which returns to the polls this weekend following the cancellation of presidential elections last December. Back then, the country's constitutional court annulled the first round of voting just 48 hours before a runoff vote was set to begin. The decision came after a far-right candidate, Călin Georgescu, shot unexpectedly into the lead, fueling allegations of Russian interference, claims Moscow has dismissed. This political chaos left a sour taste among voters of various persuasions, as Tessa Dunlop discovered in Bucharest.
Mircea Toma is a bit of a dude, 72 years old, sporting designer stubble, and drinking a Leffe beer in his attractive 1930s Bucharest home. After a lifetime of activism, not much knocks him off his stride. But of one thing he is certain: Romania has just had a near miss. It wasn't pretty, and critics insist it was undemocratic. But according to Mircea, the cancellation of the December presidential election was essential. Had populist outrider Călin Georgescu been allowed to win the final round, he says the implications for Romania, the EU and NATO would have been huge. Mircea is a member of Romania's National Audiovisual Council, one of the organisations which flagged potential outside interference in Romania's digital sphere during the first round of the election campaign. Just 2 days before the final round of voting, when presented with declassified intelligence documents, Romania's Constitutional Court cancelled the entire election. It's due to be rerun on the 4th of May, a contest from which far-right frontrunner Georgescu has been disqualified. He's now under investigation for offences ranging from fascist associations to falsified campaign finances, though he's repeatedly denied any wrongdoing. "We're at war," explains Mircea. He's alluding to both Russian interference and the conflict that rages beyond Romania's border in Ukraine. "There are different rules in war. Did not Britain have censorship in World War II?" he insists. But today, censorship and democracy are concepts challenged by new, fast-evolving frontiers, online and on social media. According to Mircea, Romania's fledgling democracy is particularly vulnerable in the face of mis- and disinformation. Romania's former communist dictator Nicolae Ceausescu's brutal rule left no space for independent thought or media discernment. After the 1989 revolution, the country had some catching up to do, and then along came the internet. Scroll forward 35 years to a spring afternoon in 2025, and Bucharest's Victory Square, Piața Victoriei, home to numerous recent protests, is relatively quiet. There's a limp flag, a couple of tents, and a poster decrying the Constitutional Court and the former pro-EU president behind the decision to cancel Romania's December election. A handful of hardcore protesters are marking time. One gives me a white rose. The other agrees to an interview. Pietri, a man in his 50s, he's well turned out in pressed jeans and leather shoes despite several nights in a tent. And he's indignant. I'm upset about the cancelled election in December. It's a huge abuse from the High Court. Pietri explains he didn't vote for Călin Georgescu in the first round, but in this second presidential election he will vote for the leading hard-right candidate, Georgi Simion, because he's so angry. The democratic will of the people was denied. 2 million voters were ignored. We record a brief interaction together on our phones, and I bid him and his comrades farewell. Later that evening, my Bucharest landlady texts me out of the blue. "You met Petri!" she exclaims. I discover she's not a personal friend of his, but rather follows Petri on TikTok. I check my phone. He's posted our exchange. It's already clocked up 70,000 views. Earlier that afternoon, he was one of just 5 people protesting in Victory Square. But in our brave new world, Petri is a rising social media star. He's not a Russian bot. He's a very angry activist in democratic Romania, one of many whose fury has bolstered ultra-nationalist Georgi Simion's chances in Sunday's election. This self-styled MAGA man and presidential favourite announced his candidacy after Georgescu was barred and is at best equivocal about Romania's membership of NATO and the EU. I think back to my interview with Mircea Toma and his absolute certainty that Romania was and still is fighting a cyber war with an external Russian enemy. And I wonder how it is that both Petri and Mircea are fighting on different sides but want the same thing, a democratic, secure Romania. Back in London, a couple of weeks later, I check in with Petri's progress. He assures his followers that with the help of God, Doamna ajută, they will succeed. But in today's Romania, a country of great faith and mighty algorithms, exactly what that success will look like is anyone's guess.
Tessa Dunlop.
I'm Krasi Ivanova-Twig from the Global Jigsaw podcast from the BBC, where we explore President Putin's idea of what it is to be Russian. It's packed up in one expression that's become the catchphrase of the moment, the Russian cultural code. We ask, what does it mean? The Global Jigsaw looks at the world through the lens of its media. Find us wherever you get your BBC podcasts.
Hello, it's Ray Winstone. I'm here to tell you about my podcast on BBC Radio 4, History's Toughest Heroes. I've got stories about the pioneers, the rebels, the outcasts who define tough.
And that was the first time that anybody ever ran a car up that fast with no tires on. It almost feels like your eyeballs are going to come out of your head.
Tough enough for you? Subscribe to History's Toughest Heroes wherever you get your podcast.
The Bolivian city of Potosí was once a major economic centre of the Spanish Empire, thanks to the discovery of a mountain of silver in the 16th century. Once an isolated Incan hamlet, the area was transformed into a bustling city that became home to more than 150,000 people, as Peruvian and African workers were brought in and forced to work down Spanish mines. The mountain, the Cerro Rico, is still mined today, mostly for zinc and tin, but the land has become unstable and the city a shell of what it once was, as Carolyn Lamberley discovered.
My forehead is burning, and every atom in my body feels like a weight is trying to push it down. I arrived in Potosí the previous night. At roughly 13,000 feet above sea level, it's one of the highest cities in the world. Silver was discovered here in the 1500s, and quickly, Potosí became the economic center of the former Spanish Empire. Legend has it that there was once so much silver in Cerro Rico, literally the rich mountain, that you could build a silver bridge from Potosí to Spain. Cerro Rico towers above Potosí like a guardian angel, but it's got a dark history. Those who went to work in the Cerro knew that they would probably never come back, Jacinto, a longtime resident, tells me. One of the streets running through the middle of the town leads straight to the mountain. Back in the days of the Spanish, people used to call it the Calle de los Lamentos, the Street of Laments. Stay here long enough, and you'll hear all sorts of hair-raising, supernatural stories. There's still plenty of human misery, as well as human effort, here today. Centuries after the Spanish left, the Cerro is still full of precious metals and minerals. Before even setting foot in Potosí, I had written off the main attraction, a tour inside the mines, mainly because I'm claustrophobic. By day 2, my altitude sickness has completely subsided, so I step out, ready to explore. A fellow guest at my hostel convinces me to go to Porco, another mining town around an hour away. It's mid-morning and the sun is beating down when we get there. The first person we bump into is wearing a cap that says Minería Responsable, responsible mining. He's standing just outside a mine shaft. He tells me he's got his own company and that he gives his workers a percentage of the earnings. This mountain is not like Cerro Rico, which has been totally destroyed by centuries of mining, he says. Here in Porco, parts of the mountain are still sound. Further up the slopes, there's a small yellow chapel. The main entrance is covered in black streaks, the blood of llamas, left as a sacrifice to the mountain. People in this region believe in a deity called El Tío, which literally translates as the uncle. But he's more like a god of the underworld. Miners bring him offerings in the hope he'll give them his protection in return. We bump into another miner. He's very drunk, and I can hardly make out any word he's saying, whether he's on his way to work or coming back home. People here are big drinkers. It's the only way to cope with working in the mines, people tell me. We come across Enrique. He's in his 50s, but looks years older. He's from Bolivia's capital, La Paz, and he's been coming to work in the mines in Porco for the past 10 years. He stays in Porco for a few months at a time, and when he's made enough money, he goes back home for a bit. We sit down and chat. He tells me about his kids. One of them is a lawyer, the other, a housewife. As Enrique gets ready to go back underground, I catch a ride with some miners who've just come off shift and are heading back to the center of Porco. Next to me is a guy who's covered in dust. He keeps nodding off. In town, we grab some lunch, get on another minibus, and make a stop at some hot springs. By the time we're done, it's getting late, and there's no buses in sight, so we hitch another ride to return to Potosí. I clamber into the back of the car. Next to me is Simon, a miner from the city of Cochabamba, and his son Jonathan, who's just turned 6. I've only just been able to leave Cochabamba yesterday, Simon tells me. Bolivia is known for its protests and roadblocks, and the past weeks are no exception. As we speed along, young Jonathan insists on covering me with his blanket. He's going on about searching for precious stones with a lupa and luz, a magnifying glass and a torch. By now we've returned back to Potosí, and I catch a glimpse of one of the statues in town. It shows a miner standing proudly, holding a rifle in one hand and a drill in the other. It's as though he's keeping watch over the city.
Carolyn Lamberley. And finally to Rome, where, after the death of Pope Francis, cardinals from around the world have gathered to select a successor in the conclave, which will begin on Wednesday. Veteran BBC Vatican correspondent David Willey has been watching closely the lively lobbying taking place as church leaders deliberate what kind of leader they want to take over the running of this millenary institution.
This will be the 5th papal election that I reported on, and there's already the usual febrile speculation about possible winners. The bookmaker's favourite, I'm told, is Cardinal Parolin, Pope Francis's former number 2, a rather uncharismatic Italian, but the field remains wide open. My own tip, which I hesitate to announce, would be to look for the chances of another Italian, possibly one with a background of love for the poor and competence in high-level international diplomacy. The rather theatrical and arcane ritual of a Vatican conclave, the secretive method chosen by the Catholic Church to elect a successor when a pope dies or retires, has a long and fascinating history. Pope watchers expect this year's conclave to last only 2 or 3 days, But back in the Middle Ages, papal elections often had to be held outside a turbulent Rome for security reasons. This longest conclave ever held took place in Viterbo towards the end of the 13th century. It went on for nearly 3 years. Finally, losing patience, the authorities decided to start removing the roof of the building sheltering the church leaders. They were rained upon as they debated and prayed endlessly to, as they said, let in the Holy Spirit to guide them. Their rations were reduced to a diet of bread and water, and eventually their choice fell on an Italian cleric who happened to be taking part in the Crusades in the Holy Land. It took months more for news of his election to arrive in Jerusalem and for him to travel to Rome. Only 19 cardinals, practically all of them Italian and French, took part in that long-winded medieval Viterbo vote. This month, more than 130 red-robed prelates from around the world will fill up their balloting slips in the Sistine Chapel, voting 4 times a day until one of the candidates reaches a 75% majority. For the first time in history, the Global South is widely represented in the Electoral College. Italians and Europeans still dominate, but the election of the first ever pope from Africa or Asia may be looming. The first ever cardinals from Asia were appointed only 8 years ago, while the first African bishop to get his red hat was a mere 60 years ago, though there's some historical debate about the geographical leadership of the very earliest years of the Church. Today, 60% of papal voters come from outside Europe. The trattorias and restaurants around the Vatican are packed every evening with tourists and pilgrims, but also cardinals and their supporters sitting in corners discussing voting tactics in low voices. Among them I recognised the former ally of Donald Trump, Steve Bannon, who's also a conservative Catholic and outspoken critic of Pope Francis. The pre-conclave powwow has been dominated by the decision of one Italian cardinal to recuse himself after being sentenced to imprisonment by a Vatican court for financial fraud, and by the refusal of another cardinal from Peru to obey a papal edict banning him from attending Vatican meetings after being accused of sexual abuse of adolescents. Both church leaders deny the charges against them. But the discussions I've been told about between cardinals running up to the actual vote suggest disappointment that the Church has tended to treat paedophile priests more leniently than those accused of financial crimes. This does not go down well at a particularly divisive moment when the Catholic Church is increasingly split by those wanting to continue the reforms begun by Pope Francis and the traditionalists. The rift has been particularly strong in the United States. Many Catholic dioceses there have been bankrupted after paying out huge sums to victims of paedophile priests. Yet 6 out of 9 members of the US Supreme Court are Catholics. Vice President Vance, a recent convert to Catholicism, visited the Vatican, had an exchange of views with top Vatican officials, and saw Pope Francis briefly the very day before he died. Americans remain perhaps the biggest single contributors to Vatican finances, which have fallen increasingly into the red during the past 3 financial years, and, well, money talks, even though it's unlikely to buy a papal election. The next pope is unlikely to be an American.
David Willey. And that's all for today, but you can hear more stories on the From Our Own Correspondent podcast on BBC Sounds, including a dispatch from California, where the threat of wildfires and sky-high home insurance is forcing locals to leave. We'll be back again next Saturday morning. Do join us.
I'm David Dimbleby, and from the History Podcast and BBC Radio 4, this is Invisible Hands, the story of the free market revolution.
The free market isn't solving the problem of homelessness.
Classic liberal values of free speech, free enterprise, free markets.
A hidden force that changed Britain forever.
Popular capitalism is a crusade.
And the invisible hands that shaped it.
I thought I was a Conservative.
There's a massive schism between those who believe in the continuity of our society and those who wish to destroy it.
Listen to Invisible Hands on BBC Sounds now.
I'm Krasi Ivanova-Twig from the Global Jigsaw podcast from the BBC, where we explore President Putin's idea of what it is to be Russian. It's packed up in one expression that's become the catchphrase of the moment, the Russian cultural code. We ask, what does it mean? The Global Jigsaw looks at the world through the lens of its media. Find us wherever you get your BBC podcasts.
Hello, it's Ray Winstone. I'm here to tell you about my podcast on BBC Radio 4, History's Toughest Heroes. I've got stories about the pioneers, the rebels, the outcasts who define tough.
And that was the first time that anybody ever ran a car up that fast with no tires on. It almost feels like your eyeballs are going to come out of your head.
Tough enough for you? Subscribe to History's Toughest Heroes wherever you get your podcast.